Imagine you're looking at a giant genetic map of Europe. All the countries fall into neat clusters. Southern Europe together, Eastern Europe together, Scandinavia together. Then the scientists add one more dot, England. And instead of clicking neatly next to its neighbors, that dot jumps somewhere completely unexpected. So strange that one research team literally called it an anomaly in the data. On Europe's genetic map, England doesn't quite behave like the country people think it is. In this video, we're going to unpack exactly why. Why English DNA doesn't line up cleanly with the rest of Europe. Why, in some ways, the average person from England is genetically closer to people across the North Sea than to people just a few hundred miles away in Wales or Ireland. And what this means if you're English, or you have English ancestry in places like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa. Stay with me all the way to the end, because I'm going to show you the one result that completely changes how we think about British versus European DNA, and it's probably not the story you were taught in school. So what does a genetic map of Europe actually look like, and where does England really sit on it? Most of us are used to political maps, borders, colors, flags. A genetic map is totally different. Scientists take DNA samples from tens of thousands of people across Europe. Then they use statistics to compress millions of genetic markers down into 2 or 3 main axes. You can think of them like invisible genetic directions. If you plot each person as a dot, people who share a lot of ancestry cluster together. Very quickly, patterns begin to appear. Southern Europeans fall in one area, Scandinavians in another, Central and Eastern Europeans in their own zones. What's fascinating is that even though the computer knows nothing about geography, the overall shape that appears on the screen often looks like a blurry map of Europe. People from Spain and Italy slide into the south. People from Norway and Sweden drift towards the north. People from Greece and the Balkans tilt towards the southeast. So when we say English DNA doesn't fit on Europe's genetic map, we're not talking about a conspiracy theory. We're talking about something very specific. When you plot English samples on this kind of map, they don't always land where you'd expect based purely on geography or on the familiar national stories we tell about the English. To see why, we have to zoom in on the British Isles. When scientists focus just on Britain and Ireland, something immediately jumps out. People from Wales, Scotland, and Ireland tend to cluster much closer together than most people expect. Meanwhile, the cluster for southern and eastern England leans away from them and drifts towards the North Sea. In plain language, the average person with deep roots in Wales, Western Scotland, or much of Ireland carries a high amount of ancestry that traces back to early Celtic-speaking populations of the Atlantic coast. The average person from England, especially from places like East Anglia, Lincolnshire, Kent, or the southeast, carries a much larger share of ancestry related to continental northern Europeans, people from what is now the Netherlands, northern Germany, Denmark, and parts of southern Scandinavia. This is the first layer of the English DNA anomaly. Genetically, large parts of England sometimes look more like a continuation of Northern Europe than like a simple extension of Celtic Britain. If you draw a line on the genetic map, one side links Wales, Ireland, and parts of Western Britain together. The other side pulls England, especially the east and south, towards Frisia, Northern Germany, Denmark, and to a lesser degree, southern Scandinavia. Already, England is not sitting neatly inside a single British cluster, but the story gets stranger when we look at how mixed English DNA really is. We're often taught the history of England as a clean sequence. Ancient Britons, then Romans, then Anglo Saxons, then Vikings, then Normans. It sounds like one group replaces another. Genetics tells a different story. When you break down English DNA, you usually see layers rather than clean replacements. Very roughly, and this is simplified for clarity, you can think of 4 big components that show up in many studies. First, there's an older Atlantic, or Celtic-like ancestry. This is related to people in Wales, Ireland, Western Scotland, Brittany, and the Atlantic coast, and it reflects populations living in Britain long before the Anglo Saxon era. Second, there's a Germanic or North Sea component related to people from northern Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and southern Scandinavia. This is where the influence of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and later some Vikings really appears. Third, there's a northwestern French or Norman-like ancestry related to northern France and Normandy. It's smaller than most people imagine, but it's there, especially in areas historically tied to Norman rule. Finally, there are other European and more recent global inputs. Romans, later migrations, trade, empire, and modern movement all leave faint traces. What makes England look like an anomaly is the proportion and pattern of these layers. The Germanic harsh North Sea component is much stronger in parts of England than almost anywhere else in Western Europe. At the same time, England still carries a significant older British Celtic-like layer, especially in the west, the north, and some rural areas, and the boundaries between these mixes aren't straight lines. 2 villages in neighboring counties can have noticeably different balances, so if you're expecting England to sit neatly between Celtic Britain and continental Europe, The DNA basically says, no, England is a weird blend of both, and the blend is uneven. That's our second anomaly, but we still haven't touched the strangest part. In some analyses, English DNA doesn't just separate from Europe, it also separates from the rest of the UK. When British and Irish samples are analysed together, the clusters usually look something like this. Wales, Western Scotland, and Ireland form a tight cluster with subtle internal variation. Cornwall and parts of Western England lean towards that cluster. Northern and Eastern England form their own cluster that drifts towards the North Sea. Some parts of Central and Southern England sit in between the two. Here's the uncomfortable implication. If you look purely at this kind of genetic map, a person from Cardiff, Dublin, and the Western Highlands may look more similar to each other than any of them look to someone from, say, Norwich or Kent. That doesn't mean they're different species or anything remotely like that. All modern humans are incredibly close genetically. But on a fine scale, the data is telling us something important. Celtic-heavy regions of the British Isles share a deep common ancestry. Heavily Germanic-influenced regions of England carry a mix that pulls them towards Frisia, northern Germany, and Denmark. This is a big reason why some researchers talk about an English genetic cluster that doesn't fit the simple political idea of the UK. On a map based purely on DNA, Britain is not a single block. The UK is not a single uniform cluster. And English doesn't simply sit halfway between Irish and German. Instead, England often looks like a borderland between two genetic worlds, the Atlantic Celtic world to the west and the North Sea Germanic world to the east. At this point, a lot of people ask, so what actually happened in England that was so different from the rest of Europe? To answer that, we need to look at the major migrations, but always with the DNA in mind. Before the Romans, Britain is part of a broad Celtic-speaking Atlantic zone stretching from Iberia through Brittany up to Ireland and western Scotland. Genetically, this is the layer that still shows up strongly in Wales, Ireland, western Scotland, and parts of Cornwall in western England. When the Romans arrive, they bring soldiers, traders, and settlers from all over the empire. Genetically, they leave a thin, patchy layer, strongest around major towns and forts. Up to this point, Britain doesn't look particularly unusual. It resembles other parts of Atlantic Europe and Roman Gaul. The major break comes after Roman authority collapses. People from across the North Sea, mainly Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, migrate into what becomes England. Older history books used to swing between two extremes. Either the Anglo Saxons wiped everyone out, or they were just a tiny warrior elite. Modern genetics suggests the truth is in between, but closer to substantial migration in some regions. In parts of eastern and southern England, the Germanic and Dash North Sea component becomes very strong. It doesn't erase the older British layer, but it significantly reshapes the average. Crucially, this level of North Sea-related ancestry is higher than in most of France, higher than in Iberia, and arranged in a pattern that doesn't match any single modern European country. In other words, England ends up with a unique blend, more Celtic-like ancestry than northern Germany or Denmark, but more North Sea Germanic ancestry than Wales, Scotland, Ireland, or much of Western Europe. That alone is enough to make England look odd on a European genetic map. Then the Vikings and later the Normans add more twists. Vikings from Denmark and Norway settle in areas like Yorkshire, the old Danelaw regions, and parts of the north and east. Genetically, they are related to the same North Sea cluster, so they reinforce that signal. Normans from northern France bring elites and some settlers after 1066. They add a northwestern French layer, but not as overwhelmingly as legend sometimes suggests. By the High Middle Ages, England has a very distinctive cocktail, a strong Atlantic Celtic foundation, shared with the rest of Britain and Ireland, a very strong North Sea Germanic overlay, especially in the east and south, and a smaller but real Norman French influence. This mix doesn't quite match anywhere else. It's not fully Celtic. It's not simply German. It's not purely Scandinavian. It's not just Norman. It's a North Sea Celtic hybrid that doesn't have a neat label on a standard genetic map, and that is the heart of the English DNA anomaly. You might now be wondering what all of this actually looks like on your own ancestry test results. Different companies use different labels, but the patterns often echo this history. People with deep English roots will typically see a large chunk labeled something like England and Northwestern Europe, or England, Wales, and Northwestern Europe. Inside that, if the company is more detailed, you might see subregions linked to East Anglia, the Midlands, southern England, and so on. Around that main block, there are often smaller slices. You might see Scotland and Ireland or Celtic populations, especially if your family is from the north or west of England. You might see Germanic Europe or Northern Europe, reflecting those North Sea connections. Occasionally there's a sliver of Norway, Denmark, or Sweden, a hint of Viking Age input. What surprises a lot of people is how fluid these labels are. Companies keep updating them as more reference samples come in, and the borders between England, the Netherlands, Northern Germany, and Denmark can look very blurry. That blurriness isn't a mistake. It's the genetic reality of a region that has been interconnected for over 1,000 years. So when your results refuse to put you neatly in a single national box, you're seeing the same thing the big population level studies see. England doesn't fit tidily into the categories our maps and flags suggest. This brings us to the big reveal we talked about at the start. If we pull back from the details, the British Isles as a whole look less like a block and more like a bridge between two major European genetic zones. On one side is the Atlantic Celtic arc, Ireland, Western Britain, Brittany, parts of Galicia, and the Atlantic coast. On the other side is the North Sea Germanic zone, the Netherlands, northern Germany, Denmark, and southern Scandinavia. Within that bridge, Wales, Ireland, and western Scotland sit closer to the Atlantic Celtic end. Eastern and southern England sit closer to the North Sea end. Northern and central England, parts of the Midlands, and the border regions sit in between, carrying strong layers of both. So, when researchers say England is an anomaly on Europe's genetic map, what they're really pointing at is this. England, and by extension much of English ancestry worldwide, is what happens when you mix an Atlantic Celtic population with a very strong dose of North Sea Germanic ancestry on an island that never completely closed its doors to outside movement. Politically, we treat Britain as a block. Genetically, it's a gradient, and England sits at the most complex part of that gradient. That's the real twist. English DNA isn't strange because it's pure or isolated. It's strange because it's unusually mixed in a very specific way that doesn't match any modern mainland country. For anyone with English roots, that has two big consequences. First, your ancestry is almost certainly more regionally specific than you think. East Anglia versus Cornwall versus Yorkshire really can show different balances of those layers. Second, your DNA is part of a bigger North Sea story that connects Britain to the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and Scandinavia, just as much as to the rest of the UK. So where does that leave us? If you have English ancestry, whether you're in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere else, your DNA is not just British, not simply Germanic, and definitely not as straightforward as most school textbooks make it sound. It's part of this English DNA anomaly, a unique blend that doesn't quite fit on Europe's neat genetic map. In upcoming videos, I'm going to break this down even further, comparing specific English regions like East Anglia, Yorkshire, and the West Country to see how different their DNA really is, looking at how Anglo Saxon, Viking, and Norman layers can show up in surnames, place names, and haplogroups, and testing real DNA results from people with long English pedigrees versus people with mixed British and European roots. If you want to understand your own ancestry better, beyond just a pie chart, this is the perfect time to stay with the channel. If you found this useful, click subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment with your main surnames, your family's home region, and what your DNA test says. I'd love to see how many of you fit the anomaly pattern we've talked about today. And share this with anyone who still thinks English DNA is simple. Their results might surprise them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.